Hello, and welcome back to the Create Podcast with me, your host, Kat. You may know Larry Ossei-Mensah as a curator and champion for the arts, but on this episode, we dive into something a little bit different and we talk about his incredible side as an artist and celebrate the debut of his brand new ceramic collection, What Survives the Fire, now on view in New York City. In this conversation, we talk about Larry's studio practice, what he values as an artist, and how travel, research, and the creative community has been contributing to his career. We also talk about tips for artists and how to maintain longevity in your art career beyond all trends and noise of the art world. We talk a lot about the meditative qualities of making art, as well as how important it is to foster relationships and so much more. I'm so excited for you to hear this conversation. And before we jump in, I want to thank our sponsor, Create Magazine, for making this show possible. You can go ahead and subscribe to Create Magazine on Substack. You can check the show notes and follow along for all our exclusive articles, opportunities for creatives, special offers for our community, behind the scenes content, and so much more. And if you're an artist, we frequently host open calls. So if you're looking for a chance to get published, go ahead and visit createmagazine.co/call-4-art to learn more and see the available opportunities we have. Without further ado, let's go ahead and chat with Larry about his incredible ceramic collection, what he sees right now in the art world, and advice for us to keep going and fostering the poetry, the devotion, and the excellence required to stay on this path. Larry, welcome to the Create Podcast. I am so excited to reconnect with you after a few years. I think last time we chatted was during COVID, which is crazy. Welcome back.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Oh, so excited to chat with you. So, for our listeners, they may know you as a curator because you, and I'm so proud of this issue, curated one of our editions during 2020. But recently, you also released a beautiful collection of art. And I would love to start with that. I would love to hear how you came about it. Were you always making art on the side or secretly? Because obviously I haven't seen it. So, I would love to hear how this came.
So what you're speaking about for your listeners is it's an exhibition called "What Survives the Fire," and it's currently on view. You can see some of it behind me at All About Clay, which is a community ceramic studio in Midtown, New York. The exhibition opened about 2 weeks ago, and it'll be on view until July 20th. And really, it's been a long kind of journey. I started doing ceramics when I was an undergrad at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, but it was more just something to do for fun. And I was always on and off for the last couple of years. And then about 3, 4 years ago, I started getting more into it consistently. And I met Nicholas O, who's also known as Dave Kim the Potter, and started taking classes at the studio that he was running, and really honestly just fell in love with ceramics and its possibilities. I think a lot of times when you think about ceramics, we're only thinking about its functional nature. And for me, I was interested in its functional nature, but I was also interested in its cultural possibilities. When you think about how different cultures kind of utilize ceramics as a material, as a tool for ritual, as a tool for gathering, as a tool for expression, and really thinking about its sculptural capacity. And so I was invited a couple months ago by the founders of the studio to make an exhibition. And so for me, it was really thinking about, what does it mean to put together a suite of works, right? So it's not just about individual objects, it's about, a conversation, a dialogue, an exchange that I wanted to have not only with my community, with the public, but then also with other ceramicists who are here. Because it's an operating studio. So people take classes, they do workshops, they're members here. And I was really interested in what that exchange and conversation looked like. But also having to meditate, because I always get, why ceramics? And I think most people don't know is that my journey in contemporary art started actually in photography.
Oh, I did not know
Right.
that.
So my late 20s, actively doing photography, but I had a day job, so it was more like a side quest. And from photography, I kind of shifted into writing and then curating. But so there was always an impetus to create. I think it was just identifying the medium that really allowed me to kind of say something and fully express myself. And I
Mm.
think that ceramics has been able to offer that. And with the exhibition, just thinking about the title, what survives the fire, I think it's kind of it's multiple layers to it. So like on a basic level, that's the process. Like you make a ceramic piece, you put it in the bisque fire, then you have a glaze fire. And sometimes the pieces survive, sometimes it could get stuck to something, sometimes they break. There's a whole multitude of things that can happen from when you put it in the kiln to when you take it out. Right. And so for me, I thought that was kind of interesting just in terms of like from a practical standpoint. And then secondarily, ceramics has just been a meditative practice. Given everything that's going on in the world, it's like, what could I find that allowed me to allow the subconscious to act, to be creative, engaging with tactile materials, and shut out the world. Because I think anybody who's done ceramics, it's very easy to come to the studio and say you're going to do one thing, and then like 6 hours later, you're still there, right? And I also like the fact that, ceramics is, or clay specifically, is a medium that continually humbles you. So regardless of whether you've been working with clay for a year, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, there's something that it can always teach you, right? And I think that's just kind of a beautiful metaphor for life, that life can always teach you if you're open to it and you're receptive to it, to teachings. And then also, but on the converse, I think it's what's great about clay and ceramics is that you see the progress. I think a lot of times we take up new endeavors. During COVID, I was making bread or whatever the case may be, and unfortunately want to see immediate progress, right?
Yeah.
And I think luckily clay is one of those things where you'll see the results if you put the time in, but it's not something where like, you're in the studio every day for a year and all of a sudden you're a master, right? I think mastery is something that is kind of a continuous exercise that hopefully many of us work towards. But I think also through the process, you figure out what it is you want to say with the material. So for me, in terms of this exhibition, it was a suite of works that, are more of like an ensemble of objects. Some of these objects are things that I made. Some of these objects are things that come from my personal archive. Some of these objects are photographs that I took when I was in Ghana early in the spring,
Mm.
and really trying to create a scenario and condition where people can reconcile their relationship with what they're seeing, right? And for me, it was also thinking about people who may not know clay as like, its potential to be this more sculptural object. And so I have to think about what are the different entry points that people can have to engage with this material and this object. So it's been a lot of fun, and people from different parts of my life have been super supportive, and it's actually been great specifically to get support from artists that I've been collaborating with and in dialogue with for like the last 15, 20 years. Because like
Wow.
you do the thing and you don't know who's watching, and some
Yeah.
people will give you like props, but I think most of my collectors are artists. So for me, I think that says that at least the work from an artistic standpoint is resonating with folks who are also on the journey of creating and sharing.
I love that. Yes. Well, congratulations and thank you for sharing. I think that so many of us, and I actually wrote a Substack yesterday about all this research that's coming out about the health benefits of art, not just for our mental health, but actual physiological, like calming a nervous system, preventing Alzheimer's, like improving longevity. And I think as someone like yourself who serves the community, who shows up so much for other people in different capacities, whether it's as a curator or you're coordinating projects or building platforms, I think reclaiming that artist identity and giving yourself that space to create and to, like you said, just shut out the world because Lord knows there's so much happening right now. I think that's really empowering. But I would love to also hear your thoughts on balancing that with your identity as a curator. As someone who also has multiple projects, I'm an artist too, and then I run the magazine and this podcast. It can be tough to sort of, I don't want to say explain yourself because you don't owe anyone an explanation, but I think there's this tendency in the world to label and categorize things. But as we see, a lot of curators are also artists, and artists become curators at some point. And I think there's so much beauty in navigating these sort of community versus personal projects. And I'd love to hear how you've been navigating that yourself.
Well, when I started doing the ceramics, initially it was for myself. It was just an exercise for myself to just kind of like, go on a journey and learn something. Because I think also the other thing is that, I'm 45, and as you mature in life, you have the thing that you do and you try to get really, really, really good at it, right? But I think there's also a benefit of finding something that like you basically have to approach it with a beginner's mind. So some people it's ceramics, other people like I was going to RISD last week, and my train mate, she was like, "Oh, I'm taking painting at the artist league," but I
Wow.
think she like works in tech, right? And so, but it's like, what are the things that are going to feed your curiosity and get you excited, right? And like, remind you that like life has so much to offer. Because I think many of us we kind of you go to school, you pick a career, you do something you love, and sometimes that thing is continuously teaching you, but then other times you just need something like different, right? And so I think it's important just for the balance of being a human being to have some type of creative outlet, whether that be cooking, gardening, making music, whatever the case may be, because it just allows you to kind of understand the fullness of being human. And I think also the fullness of like, you know, our potential, right? I don't think we need to necessarily be boxed in.
Yeah.
And so when I started, it was for me. And then I had a conversation, with Oscar Murillo, and he was asking me how's it going. And yeah, I was just saying, I'm enjoying the practice, I'm enjoying making. And he asked me, so when am I going to show the work? And I was, what are you talking about? I'm a curator, I'm
Yeah.
not an artist, right? And we had a really great conversation, and I think that conversation really gave me the permission to say I can be an artist,
Yes.
and I can be a curator, right? I think in my mind, as long as I approach both with the intention of excellence, I don't think I have to worry about like trying to like reconcile or explain to people what is what, right? I think it
Mm,
gets challenging when like you're doing something but you're only going halfway. And so
yeah.
for me, once I decided that I'm going to do this, it's like okay, I'm all in,
I
right?
love
And so
that.
like last year, I had an opportunity to go to Japan for a month and meet with like a multitude of different ceramicists.
Wow.
Ceramic families have been doing it for generations. When I was in Brazil, I was able to do the same. Copenhagen, Ghana. I visited the ceramic school at Kwame Nkrumah University in March. So I think it's like, it's very similar to my curatorial practice in that it's guided by my curiosity, um, and my desire to learn and connect the dots and try to make this information make sense to me. And then once I kind of like, you know, have some nuggets of some ideas, then it's like, okay, what does this look like in an exhibition format? Or what does this look like as a program or a workshop? So that more people can be in the conversation.
I love that.
I think the great thing when we did the opening for the exhibition is that so many people were like, "Oh, I used to do ceramics," or "I'm interested in doing a class," and I just kind of introduced them to people who worked here at the studio to at least get the information.
Mm,
But I think you know you have to be discerning because I think you can't do too many things,
yes.
right? And I think when you do too many things and none of them well, then I think that is not of service to yourself or your community. So I think it's really identifying a couple of things that like you can do well, or at least you see growth potential,
Yeah.
and you get excited about it. Like I was watching this video, there was a woman, I think in her late 50s, who wanted to be like on the tennis team at a college near her, and I think it was like Division 2 or 3, but she got better at tennis and helped them win like a championship. So
Wow.
I think at the end of the day, whatever you choose to do, and if it's something that you're really, really passionate about, let your curiosity lead you and try to learn as much about the thing as possible and not necessarily just do it because it's cool, right?
Absolutely.
Because for me, I've always just wanted to be respected by my peers, right? Because they're people who like, this is what they do every day. They've been doing this for years. And what I don't want to do is create a spectacle and not put in the time, right? And so I think as long as no one can question my effort and the quality of the work that I make, I'm fine.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing. And I totally agree. And I think, especially as I get older, I also am constantly pruning, and I hear this voice in my mind. I don't know if it's like my higher self or God, the universe, but it's like simplify, 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 and do things with excellence, like you said. And there's a book by Seth Godin I read last year. It was called The Dip. And the question was, when you hit a tough time or you hit some kind of roadblock or challenge, is, there's an option to quit or to pivot or to move on. But the question always is, are you willing to be the best in the world at whatever it is, for you, obviously, not in a competitive sense, but
Exactly.
like in your own conscious. And I'm wondering, do you have a process for what you would say yes to? Obviously, protecting your studio time now is important, but certain projects might come up or opportunities for you to do work with. How do you sort like what is worth pursuing, even if it's hot right now, like you said, or popular, without creating a spectacle? Obviously, we all need to support ourselves. Like, do you have certain markers like, okay, I need this to for my financial well-being, this for my creativity? How do you navigate decision making as an independent person?
I mean, I think for me, I start with my gut. Is it something that like gut really is pulling me? I look at the location of the project. I've been doing a lot of projects internationally, whether it be in Brazil or I've done projects in the Philippines. ARTNOIR, the nonprofit I co-founded, we just did a project in Amsterdam with OSCOM.
Wow.
So I think if it's something that provides like a dynamic challenge that's going to be an additive skill set to my toolbox, then I'm curious, right? But I think it's also who are the collaborators? What is their level of kind of seriousness and passion? And are we going to learn from each other? What's the exchange going to be? And then obviously, there has to be a monetary component that kind of makes it worthwhile. Because if we're talking about making exhibitions, exhibition making is a very difficult task. It takes a lot of work, a lot of resources, a lot of research, trust of artists, whether they're artists or you're getting to know through the process. And so I kind of factor all those variables in there where it's like, okay, are there artists that I'm in dialogue now with who could be a fit? Or are there artists that I've wanted to work with that could be a fit? So for me, it starts with intuition, gut, then you get practical. And it's been interesting, on parallel to that in terms of like ceramics, taking that slow, right? And just kind of, I was in a group show that Michael Dika curated, Evolving Clay, at Lucy Lacoste. That was my first group show as a
Congratulations.
ceramicist. Thank you. And then Storm, she's curating a group show from Superpositions this summer, and so I'll have work in that. So I think it's like it's like driving a car, right? So you know when to go slow. After you've driven a long time, you know the car and when to kind of accelerate, when to slow down, when to coast. And so it's developing that kind of discernment, right? Because every opportunity isn't like a good opportunity.
Yeah.
But then also thinking about if it isn't something that necessarily is a fit for me for whatever reason, then who in my network could this be a better fit for? So I'm always thinking about how do I pass on opportunities to other people in my community, right? Because to be an independent curator is like it's a very difficult exercise, right? You're constantly exploring opportunities, but then also sometimes you have people who come to you with ideas. And I think being able to listen, I think is super important. And also kind of like being aware of when the universe is actually providing an opportunity that you didn't know you needed, right?
Mm.
Because sometimes, there'll be a scenario where like someone's like, we want to do this collaboration with you and everything just points to like, this is not something I would do, right? But then that's where, you vet a project, right? And you vet the potential collaborators, right? And then there have been many scenarios where I've gone to people and said, hey, this person wants to do a project, not super familiar with them. I'm kind of familiar with their work. What do you think? Right. And, normally they say, hey, you should seriously think about it, or, I don't know. Right. So I think it's a combination of intuition, leveraging the network and your brain trust. I think we should all have a brain trust because no one makes career decisions, in a I hope I'm in a vacuum. right? So you have your friends, you have your families, you have your mentors, and also like your loose ties, right? And I mean, this is something that it's either Stephen Covey or Keith Ferrazzi. I forget who talks about loose ties, but like, you know, relationship with people that you may not necessarily be close to, but there's a rapport, there's a respect. You know, they have a point of view that is sharp. And a lot of times I've gotten opportunities through that where it's just like, I respect this person. They've put in the work. They've demonstrated through action, right? Because I think for me, I'm also someone who's looking at action less than words, and their action's been consistent and generative and generous. So I also look towards that, if that's what the scenario is kind of giving.
I love that. Thank you for sharing. And yeah, I think the most important thing we can do is develop our intuition. I was just reflecting on some not so great decisions I made over the past few years. And I remember, of course, hindsight is 2020, but I'm like, my body was not at ease when I made that decision. And I thought it was fear or I was afraid of growth. But sometimes our bodies just have the most wisdom, and learning to trust that uncomfortable feeling, like, no, it's not resistance. It's not fear of growth. It's actually a warning. That's something for all of
And
us
I
to get better at.
and I think it's also kind of like, it's the balance of the ego, because sometimes the ego will step in and say, XYZ, right? And I think this is where, whatever your practice is, whether it's prayer, meditation, walks, being in nature, allow the mind to kind of quiet. And I think that's also what's been good about ceramics, because sometimes there are days I come and I don't make anything. But it's really just kind of like this ritual and kind of being one with this organic material. And then sometimes I like, if there's a question or a problem that I'm working through, I find answers that way. Some
Same.
people it's running, some people it's the gym, but I think you definitely need like a space where like your mind can kind of like be hyper focused on something, and then that allows the other parts of your brain to kind of like reconcile questions or like challenges that you have, or at least bring some sense of clarity, particularly with big decisions, right? Because I
Yeah.
think, as a not only independent curator, but as an entrepreneur, right? You know, you you want to stay in rhythm, right? You want to have projects coming in, like you want to pay the rent,
Yes.
you want to pay the bills. And it's just like there definitely been projects that have come across my desk where I'm like, wow, not that interesting, but the pay is good. This wouldn't require a lot of effort. Am I going to do this, right? And I think there have been projects that have, easy payday, but the collaborator there just wasn't a simpatico. And I think it's like building the courage to say no, but then knowing and saying no that you now have to double down in another area to make sure that you maintain that financial equilibrium. And I think also just being financially responsible. I
Yeah.
think a lot of times, and that takes a balance, right?
Yes.
Because a lot of times, there's an opportunity to take a trip someplace, right?
Hmm.
And even like when those scenarios present itself for me, I'm like, okay, I'm doing this trip, and this is not just like a trip for fun. It's like, what am I going to learn in this trip? Who am I going to meet? How am I cultivating relationships? And can I generate a project out of this?
Yeah.
Right. And if I'm able to at least establish two or three really great relationships, maybe it turns into a collaboration, or at least these are people I can learn from. Or if they're like Venice was a great example where like I learned so much seeing these different exhibitions, getting to spend time with friends and colleagues. If it's not fortifying, then that trip was a waste,
Yeah.
right? I think a
100%.
lot of time people go to places and obviously you want to have fun, you want to party, but for me, it's like it's still, fortunately, unfortunately, fortunately, still work,
Yeah.
right?
It's
So
a, it's a work.
that's how you
So
look at it.
true. Thank you for sharing that. I think as artists too, and especially for younger artists who might be, when I first started getting international opportunities, and they aren't necessarily paid for, unless you sell the work and then you can make that money back. Hopefully, you break even, especially as an emerging artist. But it's tough because you want to grow your CV, you want to be in rooms with bigger players, but sometimes it's at a financial detriment. And I think it's like, once again, going back to the intuition, like, can I make this work? Is this an investment into my future? Or am I just afraid that if I don't get this fancy, like, whatever international show on my CV, that no one's going to want to work with me later? So it is definitely a balance. And I was wondering if you have any advice for, I know you mentor a lot of artists too, and you give back in that way to your community. Do you have any advice for emerging artists, especially right now? The art market is a little all over the place. And, what would you invest in if you were just starting right now? What would you say yes to?
Um,
What would you look for as an artist to grow your career?
I think, and I don't want to sound like flippant, but I think residencies are great.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's a process and an exercise. But I think a lot of times, particularly if you're lucky, where it's like three hots in the cot and the stipend, then that at
Mhm.
least gives you some time to kind of think. But also, like I was talking to some artists last week, and I said you could also do self-organized residencies, right? So like, if you and like two other friends who are artists, you can say, you know what, let's get an Airbnb, you know, in a place that's fiscally reasonable for our budget, and maybe spend a week or two there just working,
Yeah.
researching, reading. Let's critique each other's work. Because I think a lot of times people think that the only residencies you can do are the ones that are formal. A
Yeah.
lot of times I'll do residencies, in terms of last year I had an exhibition in Brazil. And instead of just going when the exhibition was supposed to like install and open, I said, hey, let me go a little bit earlier, and then I can go do studio visits. I can go to museums. I can do research, and get a better understanding of what's happening in this region, but then also how can that potentially feed projects that I'm doing in the future. I think also really making sure, are you investing in like mastering your craft? Because I think a lot of times like artists think just because you made the thing that it's good, right? And that's just not the case, right? So are you putting the hours into really like being rigorous with your practice and really learning how to edit what's strong and what's not strong, and then when it's not strong, really trying to decipher why is this not working. So I think residencies, open calls, like I just did an open call with the Eli Center. We had over 750 artists apply,
Wow.
and
Amazing.
then we selected 25. But what's cool about the Eli Center is that they have a project space, and so for artists who may not have made the final cut, they're still inviting them to do group shows in the project space, which I think is super
Amazing.
generous.
That is
Usually it's
amazing.
like you don't get it, you just get an email, right?
Yeah.
As well. And I think also just building relationships with curators. I think a lot of times, the default is like, let me get a gallery, let me build with a gallery. But a lot of times, the galleries will come into the curators for advice in terms of like, who are you looking at? Who do you think is exciting? Who's ready for the opportunity? And nine times out of 10, when you talk to emerging artists and you say, who are the curators like who know your work, who know your practice, who are in like your circle of influence, they don't have it, right? And I
Mhm.
think curators are always looking for artists to do projects, and those projects can have different faces. It could be an exhibition, it could be a book project, it could be a program. So I think that's the number one thing. If you can find curators whose interests align with your practice, so not just any curator, but like
Yeah.
you don't go to a curator who's focusing on performance and you're a painter, unless there's a performative element to your practice that may align.
Yeah.
But I think curators, and I think also like evaluating your artist network, right? Because I think a lot of times artists get opportunities or they're asked.
A
There've been
hundred
many
percent.
times I'm visiting a city, I'm not from there, who else should I visit, right? And you want to be top of mind because you never know, who's coming to town and where a discovery and a relationship can be cultivated. So, it's not easy, right? But I think, it's like having a strong network. And when I say network, this is kind of like those loose ties,
Yeah.
right? So those people that maybe you've done a residency with or been in a group show or just have a really great rapport. And then really thinking about what does my brain trust look like? Who are the people that I trust that like are really going to give me honest feedback? Because even that's something that's come up a lot, particularly whether it be residencies or MFA programs, is to critique rigorous enough, right? Because you have this kind of not so nice stereotype where they're saying like the generation coming in, it's like the glass generation. And I think if you're going to be an artist, regardless of what generation you are in, you got to be able to take feedback,
Yeah.
right? And I think a lot of times people are not open to feedback, and you basically are kind of running in circles. And if you think about like when we collaborated during COVID, if you look at a lot of those artists that were featured in the magazine, or artists who were kind of like on the cusp, what is the growth line in their practice? Are they making the same thing that they were making 6, 7 years ago? Or have they grown? Have they got more ambitious in their work? How has the practice evolved? And if you start looking at the math and the percentages, a significant amount of people didn't grow.
Yeah.
They stood, and then you have to factor in life happens,
Of course.
right? So how do
Yeah.
you navigate like just life happening? And so I think there are all these variables that I think are important to consider. So for me, it's just like, what's your brain trust look like? What does your circle of influence look like? What does your network look like? Are you building relationships with curators? You know, are you applying to residencies? And then if residencies are not necessarily manifesting itself for you, what is it to do a self-organized residency?
I
You
agree.
know, and then I think also like if you can manage it fiscally, like travel.
Yeah.
You have the Venice Biennale that's on view right now. If people can manage it, and I think going off opening is probably better because, and
Yeah.
probably after summer because it's not as like high in terms of tourism. You have Panorama, which is a great exhibition that's going to happen in Sao Paulo in the fall. If you can manage it, Basel, which I know some artists, it's like a tricky kind of like proposition. But I mean, there are also institutions that are all doing great exhibitions during that time.
Exactly.
So it's just a matter,
Sometimes
and then you
even
have,
better than the fairs. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, when you think about Kunsthal Basel and like what's happening there, right? So I think it's like really trying to get curious and whatever the resources allow. But I think also like what's happening in your town.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't count the amount of times that like I've talked to artists that live in New York and haven't seen, you know, like you have the Raphael show at the Met, right? You don't
Hmm.
necessarily need to be a Raphael fan, but like, this is not something that occurs every year. What can you glean from that exhibition? What can you learn from that? So I think it's being curious, building your brain trust, looking at your network, because I think a lot of times you forget that, oh, I did this residency with this person, or I know I have this relationship. Like the relationships sometimes are in front of you.
Yeah.
Travel if you can. If it's driving distance, train distance, plane, applying for residencies and grants, and then like if that's just not clicking for you, how can you self organize? Right?
Yeah.
Because I think at the end of the day, that's what artists do. They figure it out. They make a way when there is no way.
Absolutely. I'm so for that. And that's honestly some of the best opportunities came from just being committed to the work, showing it in some capacity, and then getting attention from maybe some bigger opportunities later. I'm wondering, from all the years that you've been curating and being in the art world, we've seen, especially during COVID, people hit their highest highs at auction and then dropping to the lowest lows. Like, what makes an artist have a longevity in their career? Like, beyond all the hype, beyond the trends and the, virality, like what makes someone like a stable identity of an artist in your opinion from what you've seen and also what you've experienced in your own art practice?
I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of commitment to a practice. I think also innovating. How do you innovate? What is your contribution to the ecosystem? Regardless of medium. I think doing projects, as many projects as you can internationally, because I think a lot of times we're under the assumption, if you live in the States, that like if I do a show in New York and LA, I've made it, right? But I found so many interesting scenarios. Like when I did the show in Manila at the Metropolitan in Manila, you had big names who people weren't familiar with, right? And so I think understanding that the art world is international, right?
Mm,
And I think being able to do projects where, a lot of the assumptions that you may have with your practice, do they resonate in a different cultural context, right? And it's interesting when it doesn't. It's a big name, and it's just like people just don't connect to it. And I think that's a great stress test to kind of really think about, okay, are these ideas that I'm exploring as expansive as they need to be? And that doesn't mean that you necessarily need to change like the practice per se, but it's like, okay, I'm a believer that what are the points of entry that people can kind of connect to with the work? I think writing, is really interesting. Like I've been doing a lot of research on Liu Fan and
Mm,
reading a lot of his writings from the late 60s. And, because at first I was like, okay, I understand he's an icon, but to look at like, his thoughts at the genesis of his career and how a lot of those thoughts, those theories, those hypotheses have remained steadfast. They've obviously kind of changed and shapeshifted based on like opportunity and material. But that's something that I would love to see more artists just writing about their practice, their ideas, writing about other artists. And it doesn't
mm,
necessarily have to be something you publish, but I think it's really kind of interrogating the questions that you have in your mind. And it's not just kind of an action. It's like, what does your research look like?
uh,
And it doesn't have to be art historical. It could be literature, it could be cultural, it could be music, it could be nightlife, right? So I think it's like, what are the things that allow the work to feel singular? How are you innovating? How are you expressing a unique point of view? Because I think, you know, we all, well, not all, some of us start with a point of reference, right? And even if you're starting with a point of reference, how do you then kind of evolve away from that and really like express who you are? And I think a lot of times the artists that have really resonated with me, you see them in their work, right? You see their ideas in their work. And I think also like the ones who like whether their work was selling for $1 or $1 million, they're still gonna work,
yeah,
right? And I think that just takes courage.
yeah,
And it's like again, life happens, and when life is happening, do you still have the wherewithal to still go into the studio? You may not have a studio, so then like, do you create a space in your dining room to make work? Right. So
yes,
it's just kind of like Leonardo Drew likes to say, it's kind of like an addiction,
it
right?
is.
So you're gonna make regardless of whether you got a studio, whether you're working from home. If you don't have access to the greatest materials, it's like, okay, I'm gonna, you know, go to the supermarket and get the circulars and make sculptures out of that.
Hmm.
Right. So it's really trying to be creative regardless of it and be responsive, I guess, to the moment.
Yes,
Right.
that's so beautiful. I know no one likes to go through tough times, but every time I have, even making work on the kitchen table, and I look back and I'm like, that was so badass, you know? Like that was it. That was it. And nothing really changed except to have nicer things and nicer materials and nicer opportunities. But the essence of it is still the same feeling and the same commitment. So thank you for affirming that. I love that so, so much. And what's currently inspiring you as you just had this incredible show? And I'm going to post pictures in our blog as well for our listeners to
Yeah.
make sure they
Well,
enjoy.
this is, I'll go around really quickly.
Yes, I want to see
So
it.
this is the show. You can see the title. I know it's a little glare.
I love it.
So these vignettes of works that I'm making, I think have really been inspiring. You guys can see it, and we will post pictures, and even like
Beautiful.
this kind of selection of objects. But I think right now, for me, it's the research, and now trying to figure out like, okay, like David Hammonds and Kunelis have a great show at White Cube right now in New York, and like it was interesting to see like you know they they got to know each other in the early 90s and like built a relationship, did a show together, and then you look at their work and it's just like, wow, like this is what rigor looks like.
Mhm.
This is what, you know, as cliche as it may sound, putting in the 10,000 hours
It
to
is.
really kind of like offer us a poetic gesture. And I think that for me, like regardless of the material of the artist, was like, okay, they're both trying to evoke poetry out of whether it's bottles, whether it's a sack of coal. And so I think going back and kind of like just doing some research on artists that either I've really admired or I'm kind of aware of, but like really trying to understand like what is kind of like the foundation in their practice. And I'm going to Brazil tomorrow. I'm going to spend a week there for
Amazing.
ARPA, do some studio visits. I'll go to Rio, I'll go to Sao Paulo. So I think continuing to kind of build my relationships in that community and that ecosystem. And honestly, I think, ceramics, it's makes me feel alive and makes me feel like I can contribute and like I can share, and like it's great the dialogue that I've been able to have with artists other practitioners, and people are just curious about being creative. And I think travel, I mean, it's the summer. I'm a summer baby. My birthday's next month. And so I
Oh,
think
happy early
like,
birthday.
thank you. So the energy shifts in the summer, right? And so you
Yeah,
feel like things are more possible. And
I
so I
love
think for
that.
me, just kind of like doubling down on that, traveling where I can, and seeing art. I think
Yeah,
right now seeing art is what's been inspiring to me. To have the privilege of being able to go to Venice and support the Koyo's incredible vision, and the incredible curators who were able to bring that vision to fruition. But also just to see artists who I've gotten to know over the last 15, 20 years have their moment, but then all the shows that were in dialogue, to go to Dries Van Norton's foundation, for example, or to see Michael Armitage's work. So I think really just being a fan, so I think
Mm,
remaining a fan, because I think a lot of times we can be jaded by the extracurriculars that come with being in this community, that aren't necessarily always generative. And so for me, it's like bringing it back to basics and making it about art, artists, dialogue, exchange, and then seeing what that kind of germinates in terms of a question that sometimes can result in an exhibition, or just maybe like, okay, let me do some more research just for my own personal knowledge and understanding.
beautiful. I think you're doing this at the most perfect divine timing. I think as the world is just trying to find a hack and a shortcut for everything, leaning into,
Exactly.
like you said, the poetry, the devotion to our craft, that's going to be the most rare, most luxurious and precious thing. Whether you're an artist or writer or curator, I think that's the gift. And I want to thank you for doing this work
Yeah.
and for sharing it
Yeah,
with us.
no, it's my pleasure. And I think like you remind like so when I went to the foundation to produce Van Norton, luckily he was there, right? And it was kind of interesting because like my partner, she's a big fan, and she's like, "Oh my god!" And for me, like I respect the work, and so he talked about with the foundation, he really wants to celebrate like the handmade, right? And so I think with all the tools that are available to us through AI, or I think it opens up a lot of possibilities for efficiencies, right? So
Mhm.
I'm not an AI hater, but I think also it's an invitation to kind of double down and what can the creative mind offer, right? Because
Yeah,
I was watching an interview with like an venture exec, and he said, AI works off past information,
yeah,
right? And the job of the creatives, the creators, artists, makers, is to dream a future that doesn't exist,
yeah,
right? And so I think a lot of that comes through making and creating, and also just being amongst each other, and how can we make a world, particularly when you look at this climate, and it's like every day is a question mark, and not allowing the uncertainty and the tension to impede us from making, from sharing, emoting, writing that book, writing that composition, making this vessel, right? And I think for me personally, that's why ceramics has just been so fortified. Because you look at the news, you see something, you're just like, to be able to just kind of go sit at a wheel for an hour or two and then come out and just be like, okay, it's not the end of the world. What can we do collectively to kind of make the world better, even if it's our kind of little zone, right? And so I think doubling down on making, maker culture, creating, supporting that, I think that's going to be a very, very important exercise for us as a collective.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I totally agree. Larry, thank you so much for being back on the show. And I'm so grateful
Thank
for
you.
all the work you're doing, both as an artist and as a community facilitator. I would love to know, where can our listeners find you? How can we support you? What's coming up next for you, other than the exciting travel plans that you have?
Um, so you can follow me on Instagram. It's my name at Larry Ossei-Mensah. You can also follow Art Noir at Art Noir CO, and www.artnoir. No, www.artnoir.co. And then All About Clay, you can follow us on Instagram.
Amazing.
We got a lot of incredible things coming. We're actually going to start the new semester of classes and workshops. So
Amazing.
you can follow All About Clay on Instagram. And honestly, just the next phase is just like continuing to work on projects, do research, and try to discover new things, whether it's about myself, whether it's about other artists, and trying to keep it fun. I
Yeah.
think that's the other thing. I think yeah, life is, provides its challenges and its opportunities, but I think also like how do we ensure that we're having a good time? And then also New York Knicks going to the NBA Finals. So I think watching the Knicks bring the first championship to New York in 53 years,
No, it's
that will be
amazing.
the ultimate gift this year.
And a birthday present for you.
Exactly.
Oh my goodness. Well, it was such a pleasure, Larry. Thank you so much for all your wisdom and for sharing. And congratulations on your beautiful work.
Thank you. I appreciate you and your time. Thank you all the work that you for all the work
Thank
that you're
you.
doing as well.
Thank you.